when you have these irrational thoughts that come up that are like, something, you go on a bad date and you immediately say, like your romantic life is over to yourself. It's not the power of positive thinking. It's the power of critical thinking.
You're listening to the Elevate podcast, and I'm your host, Robert Glazer. Join me as I talk to world-class performers about how they build their capacity and reach greater heights in leadership, business, and life, and how you can do the same. Welcome to the Elevate podcast. Our quote for today is from Noam Chomsky. If you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. My guest today, Greg Lukianoff, is on the front lines of the debate over free speech in America. Greg is an attorney and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, also known as FIRE. He's also the New York Times bestselling author of several books, including The Coddling of the American Mind and The Canceling of the American Mind. Greg, thanks for joining me on the Elevate podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
I always like to start with childhood, and given that free expression and free speech are such a foundational element in your life's work, I did want to ask you, do you remember when you were first introduced to these concepts growing up, and where do you think your passion for them came from?
Oh, yeah. I mean, actually, my second, I'm giving a commencement address for the first time in my life at University of South Florida Medical School. A little intimidated, I'll be honest. And my second earliest memory was being caught between my mother and father. My mother is ethnically Irish, grew up in Britain, and thinks of herself as British, so she has an exaggerated sense of politeness. My dad is ethnically Russian, grew up in Yugoslavia, and thinks of himself as Russian, and he has an exaggerated sense of brutal honesty.
Directness, yeah.
and the first time I got a Christmas present that I hated, it was this plastic drum from my auntie Rona. I hated it, but I was looking at my mom, realizing I had to be polite, looking at my dad, realizing I had to be honest, back and forth. And so I started crying like any 4-year-old would do. And my sister, I remember being like, "Oh, poor baby, doesn't like his gift," starts crying. And I wish I could have been like, "No, but this is my first time facing a fundamental paradox." But ultimately, kind of like the tension between being polite and honest is something I've been aware of my whole life. But almost as soon as that, I was aware of the fact that my family had to flee the Soviets and really the Bolsheviks, because my grandfather fought the Bolshevik Revolution. And I'm not aristocracy. I'm related to serfs, going back, but we were murdered by the millions, under the Soviets. A lot of us were given the nickname kulaks, which were basically just peasants who did well. And so I was very aware of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And I grew up in a neighborhood that had a lot of kids who were either immigrants from Vietnam or were born, or their parents were, or from Korea, from some authoritarian regimes in South America as well. So we all took freedom of speech very seriously, and sometimes puzzled at Americans for not appreciating it enough. Now, to be clear, I was raised in the 1980s, and I was a teenager in the 1990s. Pretty great time to be both of those things. And yeah, but free speech was something where there would seem to be sort of bipartisan consensus on. So it wasn't like I feel now.
Right. This wasn't a controversial topic.
Yeah. It wasn't like I feel now, which is just like, okay, it's freaking me out a little bit that it seems like only, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, a lot of the people who are most concerned about free speech in the United States either have some connection to totalitarianism in their family, or have lived over there. Like they've seen how bad things can be.
Right. The more you get away from being connected to the opposite, the more you don't understand what it really means.
Yeah. And we didn't have to worry about that quite as much when we at least appreciated that, the Soviet Union was a great evil and the Eastern Bloc was oppressed. And as we get further away from it, I feel like that aspect, watching people on Twitter now be like, "Oh, well, Stalin wasn't that bad," is like, oh my God, how did this happen so fast?
A lot of people that seem to celebrate these systems to which they have never lived in or been subject to.
Yeah. and living in Eastern Europe after the fact, because like a lot of people they're like, "Oh yeah, sure." Like if they're trying to appear reasonable, they'll be like, "Oh, well, Stalin, sure, he's a mass murderer." But later it wasn't so bad. And I'm like, yes, it was. It wasn't as murdery, to be fair. But in terms of like the people I was dealing with when I lived in Prague, in the 90s, they were people who were, jailed. There were people who were beaten. And it also created a dynamic where they were just really afraid to be themselves because they knew their friends might turn them in.
Yeah. So you joined FIRE in 2001, and at that point, I think the organization had been around for a couple of years, and you had gone to law school. Your background as a lawyer.
Yep.
What was the organization's scale and sort of priorities when you arrived?
It was only about a year and a half old, and I was one of 6 employees. I was hired to be the first legal director of FIRE. I hyper specialized in First Amendment in law school. I took every class that Stanford offered on First Amendment. When I ran out, I did 6 credits on censorship during the Tudor dynasty of my own creation. And then I also interned at the ACLU while I was in school. So I really did put, kind of crazily, put all my eggs into the First Amendment basket, hoping that I would find a job in it. But by the good news about specializing that well is that it meant that much. It meant when Harvey Silverglate contacted the then head of Stanford Law, Kathleen Sullivan, to who she would recommend as someone to be the first legal director of FIRE. She actually recommended me by name, which remains like the biggest compliment I've ever gotten in my entire life. So it was a very small scale. We were fighting for free speech on college campuses. It was right after 9/11, so overwhelmingly my cases were oftentimes highly unsympathetic cases of speech, a lot of times with threats coming from the right after 9/11. And we had a lot of cases where, I immediately got used to getting lots of hate mail. But I think
which in itself is an expression of free speech.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think being, having a baptism, oh God, I've stumbled into this. Yeah. A baptism of fire was really helpful to me being, to the character of the whole organization to be kind of indifferent to, like we're going to defend free speech no matter what, and people are going to hate us for it, and that's
right.
Okay.
If both sides, I was just saying, the deal that both sides hate is the right deal, right? Yes. And if both, I used that recently. So let's start at the top, because I think one of the things that's gotten lost. I would love to hear when you talk about the mission of FIRE, but what is the definition of free speech in your mind? What is it? What is it not? Again, I think there's a lot of things around, like, doesn't mean you're free from consequences. I think people are totally mistaking, the free speech in the public domain and what it means from the government or private. So given this is your expertise, could you just set the foundation for us on that?
Yeah, I mean, free speech, I have a very, surprisingly, I have a very expansive view of what free speech means.
Well, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
And I tend to think of it as the big Boolean circle around everything from the scientific method to academic freedom to certain aspects of small L liberalism, expression, all live. I think that's the bigger term is freedom of speech. And of course, sometimes critics are kind of like, but there are rules when it comes to academic freedom. And it's like, well, yeah, the First Amendment interprets what freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment means in different contexts to make sense, and yeah, it is true in the academic and scientific context, you have certain rules, but that doesn't make it any less about the sharing of ideas, about the idea that kind of like thought experiments are always allowed, the idea that you can question, because as soon as you can't question something, then you're talking about fundamentalism, as Jonathan Rauch would call it. So I tend to think of free speech as being very expansive. I think that we do something very smart in First Amendment law, is that rather than do what the Europeans have done, and in my opinion, in a way that it has been disastrous in some cases, a ad hoc kind of balancing of like, we believe in free speech, but maybe this cartoonist should go to jail. And this one shouldn't. I've watched these debates and been like, okay, this is nonsensical, but okay. But what we do in the United States instead, and I think this makes a lot of sense from a psychological standpoint for judges, is we more or less have choice architecture, which is saying that rather than having balancing tests all the time, we're going to have specific walled off categories of speech that are not protected. And oftentimes, frankly, because they're arguably, more like action in some cases. So, for example, true threats, not protected. And to be clear, nor should they be. I actually think failure to investigate true threats, particularly online, has led to some hostility to free speech that we don't, that we wouldn't need to live with, because saying I'm going to kill you, in a circumstance where it seems likely that this might actually be carried out, that's not protected, nor should it be. Discriminatory harassment is not protected, which is a pattern of discriminatory behavior directed at an individual. Now, it has to take place in a regulated environment, so that includes things like the workplace or in higher ed. But we think that should be a very high bar, or else, as it's happened throughout my entire career, to be clear, harassment rationales have been abused just to go after speech that's offensive. Now, and here's the thing that kind of a lot of Europeans don't understand about the distinction between American law and European law. We have something from a 1989 case called Texas v. Johnson that's about whether or not you can burn an American flag. We have something that is our bedrock principle when it comes to free speech. And that's that you cannot ban speech simply because it's offensive. And I think that this is a great rule for a genuinely pluralistic, multicultural society, because we can't even agree. I mean, and
we can't agree on what's offensive.
We can't even agree on what's offensive. It's different from person to person, from year to year. It's different across genders. It's certainly different, different religions, but also people from different countries, and certainly different, between my mom and my dad, which really kind of made this really apparent.
Real for you, yeah.
But yeah, a lot of the stuff that people will bring to me, be kind of like, well, Mr. First Amendment, I bet you believe that what happened at Berkeley recently, where they, swarmed a speech by an IDF soldier, broke windows and forced them to flee. Well, that's just free speech. I'm like, no, it isn't. That is classic
that's intimidation.
Censorship. That's intimidation. That's illegal for all sorts of appropriate reasons. So a lot of times when people bring me examples of things that they think are especially outrageous, actually most of the time, at least in the U.S., they're pointing to things that I'm like, yeah, actually that's a threat, that's harassment, that's
right. The distinction, which again, the leadership on campuses has just been deplorable. But the difference between sitting down and protesting someone and blocking students from get to class or intimidating them or getting in front of door, like that's a different thing. That when to me, it's just when you're interfering with someone else's ability to live, that sort of crosses a line.
Yeah, no, agreed. And that's something where, when we talk about mob censorship, what they're doing is they are asserting their own, like the mob censors are basically saying,
taking away other people's rights.
Exactly, because I don't like you. These people behind me are not allowed to hear you. And it's like, that is the very heart of censorship.
Right. Versus don't go listen to that person.
Sure. Or protest outside.
Yeah. So that's your definition. And look, one of the things that's been made complicated, I'm really curious of your thing on this, and I'll give an example, not necessarily it's my belief, but just illustrative. I think when you talk about hate speech and threatening speech, I think we used to have a clearer definition of what that means. But now there are some people who have muddied that line by saying, again, someone says there are two genders, right? And then that's their argument. And then that is also thrown into hate speech. How does one adjudicate that?
Well, those are two very different things.
Yeah.
Threats are not protected, nor should they be. Intimidation is not protected. Like I said, discriminatory harassment isn't as well. And certainly assault and violence are not protected.
Right.
And I've seen a lot of that, unfortunately, on campuses in the past couple months. But hate speech in the United States isn't really a thing. It's not recognized by law, nor could it be, partially because of the First Amendment bedrock principle that essentially it can't just be that it's offensive. So racial slurs are protected in the United States. A pattern of behavior where you follow someone around shouting racial epithets at them
is intimidation.
That could be intimidation. That could be discriminatory harassment. It can be part of a pattern, but just the words themselves are not magically unprotected because they're offensive. So they're and I really think the beginning of the end for free speech on campus started with the hate speech movement, the goal of banning racist, sexist speech started by people like Richard Delgado and Mary Matsuda and other of the founders of critical race theory in the late 1970s going up through the mid 1990s. So I think that hate speech has been an absolutely amazing PR win for pro-censorship forces, but I will always oppose it being the law.
So one of the things I've said is that books are kind of like wine. I think the best one, and I heard someone say he doesn't judge a book before 10 years, which I thought was really interesting. And the best ones just get better and better over time, and the worst ones have their moment and then turn to vinegar pretty quickly. So in 2018, you and your co-author Jonathan Haidt published a book called "Coddling of the American Mind." It was based on a popular article of the same name you wrote a few years earlier. And my rule on books is like when 3 to 4 people mention it from different concentric circles, it kind of goes on my night table. It might sit there for a while. But when I read that book, I told people, and I've recommended it to probably 100 people at this point, it was one of the most important books I had read in the past 10 years, because I was in this sweet spot of my kids weren't in college yet. I had been out of college for 20 years. I just missed what was going on. I had no idea. Like, I was just like, I had no context with it. But it was kind of shocking. And we led up to this, but like, I think the insights in that book turned outright prophetic this year with what we're seeing going on. So if you could rewind the clock back to 2018, 2016, how did you and Jonathan come to collaborate? What were you both seeing that you were like, this is going to be a problem?
Well, it starts with a very, light, easy, and breezy story about me getting suicidally depressed in 2007 and being hospitalized as a danger to myself. And this came from being president of FIRE. I'd gone from being legal director to president in 2006. And there was something genuinely exhausting about being in the culture war all the time and having, in some cases, conservatives literally wanting to get in bar fights with me for some of the cases we took on, and having girlfriends mad at me that I defended Republicans. And it's just, it can be profoundly alienating, particularly if you're living in a place like I was living at the time, Philadelphia, where I just didn't have a lot of, friends and family around. So I got really depressed, and the culture was a huge part of that. And as I was recovering, I was studying cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think it's no exaggeration to say CBT, saved my life. But it's something that works relatively slowly. You have to practice it all the time for it to work. Indeed, I really feel like I need to brush up on it lately. But basically, what the incredible wisdom of CBT is that when you have these irrational thoughts that come up that are like, something, you go on a bad date and you immediately say, like your romantic life is over to yourself. It's not the power of positive thinking, it's the power of critical thinking, and taking that thought and writing it down and actually asking yourself, is this rational? And then asking, is it a cognitive distortion? And cognitive distortions are things like catastrophizing, mind reading, which means like what's in the other person's mind, fortune telling, that how things will work out, overgeneralizing, all of these bad, lazy mental habits that when you're anxious and depressed, you have a lot more of them. Just kind of like everything is doom, everything leads to the other. What the awful things people are thinking and saying about you, all this kind of stuff that simply doesn't stand up to rational rational scrutiny. But meanwhile, since I was working on campus, I was looking at the way administrators were behaving towards students back then, and the rationales they were using to censor, and being like, it seems like they're actually telling students, do catastrophize, do overgeneralize, do engage in cognitive distortions in general. But thank goodness the students
do assume the worst in everything. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But thank goodness the students aren't buying this, because back then the students weren't. But that changed dramatically and really suddenly right at the end of 2013, but particularly going into 2014. It was so dramatic that a lot of us hopped on the phone, like, what just happened on campus? Why did students go from being actually...
And I'm sure you're going to answer this, but I'm very curious about why then? Like, what was the time implication?
Well, I'll come back to that.
Yeah.
So something really dramatic was going on in 2014. It wasn't a subtle shift at all. And students who had always been good on free speech suddenly weren't. And there were a lot of times they were justifying their censorship through medicalized rationales. And what they were saying was, this person can't be on campus because it might be catastrophic to some other group on campus, that because they have evil thoughts in their heart, mind reading, because all of these oversimplified kind of moralistic language was also usually said in the language of trauma as well. And so I was like, okay, these are cognitive distortions. The justifications that they're using for censorship are themselves distorted thinking. The kind
And
of
where is
stuff,
it coming from?
yeah,
Right.
and the kind of thing that I was trained not
To do it's so funny because I came to this totally separately. I'm like, no psychiatrist would ever, the way you get over trauma is you do CBT, and it's about facing the fears. It's very interesting that you bring this up. I didn't realize this was the genesis.
Yeah, and that's where it came from. And so I told my staff about this idea I'd been thinking about for a long time, combining sort of the free speech and academic freedom argument with cognitive behavioral therapy. And I got crickets because I just thought this was kind of a weird idea. I brought to my new friend, Jonathan Haidt, and he thought it was great. And he thought it was super fascinating. And so in 2014, we decided to write an article, which I titled, by the way, Arguing Towards Misery, to better explain what I was talking about.
And the editor fought you on the title, right? I read this. Yeah.
And we lost, and ended up being Coddling of the American Mind, a title I've never liked. And got
But
stuck.
It worked for you.
Yeah, it did. I got stuck with it again for the book. I wanted to call that Disempowered, because I felt like that's what we were doing to young people through cognitive distortions. So that's what led us down the path to doing this, basically saying that the same things that are going to be threats to academic freedom and free speech are also going to be a disaster for mental health. And then, unfortunately, and at the time, the data wasn't out. We just knew the stories from campus and how mental health facilities were saying they were overwhelmed. But when the data came out, unfortunately, and as it's continued to get worse, the threat to academic freedom and free speech was profound. And the decline in youth mental health is, not to catastrophize, but catastrophic.
Let's double click on that point, because the reason why ostensibly a lot of administrators and look, I come from the business world where when you don't get the outcome you want, you change the behavior, right? And ostensibly trigger warnings and all these things are done to protect people. The overwhelming data is that people are worse off, more depressed, more mental health. The data is pretty clear that trigger warnings actually don't work. So why are people doubling and tripling? This is to me like parenting philosophy. If you say to someone, this parenting philosophy doesn't work, and they double and triple down on aspects of helicopter parenting. Why is behavior so disconnected from the obvious outcomes? Do people can't admit maybe they were wrong? Like this is eminently confusing to me.
Well, I mean, it's the great lesson of the 20th century that we didn't really learn. It's ideology. Ideology makes even bright people stupid. And that essentially, if you have a particularly rigid political ideology that oversimplifies the universe, but can be a calming force, and also, by the way, allows you to win arguments in dormitories in the 1980s and 90s, it has a tendency to stick in an environment that has insufficiently low levels of disagreement, also known as viewpoint diversity. And viewpoint diversity in higher ed has been declining, pretty consistently over the years. In some departments, it basically doesn't exist. You have politicized departments that are very explicitly politicized.
Right. They're teaching opinions. They're
teaching ideology.
Yeah.
And some of that ideology that was once kind of a little bit like, not exactly scoffed at, but greeted with a fair amount of skepticism, like intersectionality, have become treated a little bit like, like almost like sacred
gospel.
Ideas.
Yeah.
And so what I think the big administrative class on campus, one of the things, and every motivation is mixed. There is the motivation for peace and quiet on campus. That's manifest in a lot of fire cases that we see over the years. But there's also the ideological component that if you believe in a simplified dynamic of oppressor versus oppressed, or for that matter, if you're concerned about the Office of Civil Rights, the Department of Education investigating you have some incentive to investigate things that people claim are discriminatory harassment, but fall far, far short of that. A lot of things kind of conspired to create an environment in which there was a lot of policing of freedom of speech going back decades, and was certainly already more pronounced than I was expecting it to be when I began it even way back in 2001. And because of the ideological bent of administrators and of campuses themselves, it had an ideological component as well. So this got reinforced over and over again. Now, here's one of the harder problems to solve is how did it end up in the minds of students? Well, one, the kind of students who tend to go to elite colleges in particular are people whose parents tended to go to elite colleges as well. So certainly they learned some of these ideological ideas in the first great wave of political correctness from 85 to 95. But also, these ideas really took off in education schools and therefore have been kind of taught downward through K through 12 all throughout the United States. But why specifically 2014? Haidt and I both think that social media both acted as an accelerant, that it sped a number of things up, that it caused the fire to get larger, but also created new trends. It created new weird platforms like Tumblr, for example, and for that matter, on the right, 4chan, that were just kind of argument places where battling for truth
extremism.
But battling for truth was never the point. It was basically like cheap ways to win arguments without winning arguments. So in my more recent book, Canceling of the American Mind, I get much more into how, and I always had the lucky break of getting to write it with a absolutely brilliant 23-year-old named Ricky Schlott, who was 20 when I first started working with her. She points out that it was absolutely true that a lot of these tactics that we now use to cancel people or get them to shut up or delegitimize them, they were already arguments that she was making in grade school, because she had her first phone when she was 10. So a lot of these tactics that we call winning arguments without winning arguments, to use ad hominem to just dismiss your opponent, they borrowed tremendously from the ideology that was coming out of campuses and coming out of K through 12.
And was she someone who felt like broke out of that as a reformer, or what was her? Yes.
Yeah, oh, she did. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But she was not trying to engage in this herself, but she watched it happen. And those were the students who started hitting campuses around 2013, 2014. People who had been on smartphones, who had been on social media since they were little, who
had just seen this. If you yell enough and whatever, you can subdue the other side, right?
Yeah, and if you use some ideological arguments that nobody wants to contradict, particularly in low viewpoint diversity environments, you're going to win. Not you're going to persuade anybody, but you're going to scare off your opponent or get them otherwise.
So people learn how to be sort of digital bullies. Is that
exactly? And so one of the things that since canceling came out, I'm like, oh my God, we are literally arguing as a society like junior high schoolers.
Well, debating versus arguing, right? And I think, look, in academia, it was always that whatever you put out there had to be challenged. I think you guys said it in the book somewhere, but one of the things that stuck out to me was, look, historically, you'd put out a position or a paper on campus, and other people they would question your opinion and bring new facts or put out a dissenting opinion or otherwise. And soon it became, no, Greg, you need to take down, I'm not going to dissent or argue or actually bring logic to your argument. You just need to take down your argument because I don't like it and it's offensive, right? And it's a totally unacademic approach to education.
Yeah, but it's easier.
Yeah.
It allows you moral certainty. It allows you a sense of righteousness. And all these things are inappropriate for intellectual endeavors. Like basically, like if your intellectual endeavors can conveniently end up getting you to say, well, what I believed in the first place is always just proven correct.
Yeah,
it's probably not. You should probably not trust that. And I think we've taught a generation of younger people to be much more comfortable in a situation in which their preconceived notions are constantly being proven correct, partially because nobody wants to contradict them.
Yeah, and talk about, I know in that book you talked about talk about a little bit about the three untruths, because I think that was really interesting. And one of the ones that stuck with me, I don't remember if it was an untruth or a sub part of that, was this, that trust your feelings, right? And that your feelings are always right. I think you guys had an example of the subway in New York, where, people are supposed to report in and trust their feelings if they see something. Out of 100,000 calls a year, there's one incident. So statistically, people's gut instinct is wrong in 99% of those cases, but we're telling people that whatever they feel is truth. So can you talk a little bit about the untruths? Because I think those explain kind of a lot of this.
Yeah, the untruths have kind of a funny story. When Haidt and I were working on the book, we started going kind of deep into intersectionality. And I realized we were starting to write a book that I didn't want to read. And I thought that one of the effective things about the original coddling article was what we do in my family to give each other advice. We're very independent minded people, and we're not the kind of people who will necessarily accept if one of us really lectures the other one on precisely what to do. So we tend to make fun of what the dumbest option would be. Like I remember saying to my sister Alex, you know what, Alex, you should really hold on to that anger, and you should ball it up, and every morning when you get up you should fixate on it, and basically just give obviously stupid advice to make the point that, okay, just what, I don't care what you do, just don't do that. And so that's what we used in coddling the American mind as a way to make our ideas more accessible. The idea of going to a guru, who's supposed to be this genius on wisdom, and the advice he gives us is, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. We actually added a fourth, by the way, in canceling of the American mind, which is no bad person has any good opinion, which is more.
Which ties interestingly to number 3, because once you put them in that bucket automatically, then they can never say anything or be anything of value, right?
Which explains so much of the ad hominem way we argue on the internet, which is more or less like, I'm not going to prove you wrong on your actual substantive argument, but I'm going to show that you're a bad person, and that means I don't have to listen to you anymore, which is childish thinking. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, in the context of the stuff in the Middle East now, there is plenty of fault on both sides, right? And there's things, but inability to sort of even nuance or say, I support Israel, but I don't support Netanyahu. Like, everything is nuanced, right? It's not, yeah.
So, and you mentioned the great untruth number 2, always trust your feelings. That's the one that sounds superficially the nicest, Oh yeah, trust your heart. But there is no wisdom tradition that tells you to uncritically always listen to your heart. A lot of growing up, a lot of becoming a mature, responsible person is not listening to your feelings. But we seem to be saying, and this gets you to the cognitive distortion of emotional reasoning. We feel like this is really being taught in K through 12 and in higher ed, that essentially if you feel something, that it must somehow be true, or it must somehow mean something. And of course, I can imagine people listening to being like, well, of course it means something. I'm like, yes, but it's often not what you think it means. And Susan, I think her name is Susan David, she had a great distillation of this. She said, emotions are data, not instructions. Because if you suddenly feel like a pang of anger, dealing with, like some girl you just met, you might discover that it really isn't because you're angry,
What also, it's subject to a lot of prejudice. So let's pretend, as a kid, 3 days in a row, I got beat up with someone by purple hair. Right, I might determine that a fourth person with purple hair is threatening, but they are not. Right, and there's understandability. But look, I was threatened because, but they're actually not. But I'm making my body's doing a whole judgment thing that is. I understand why it's doing it, but it's not. It's not. It's not right a lot of the time.
Yeah, and a lot of times when you're critical about what you're feeling, and just like you learn in cognitive behavioral therapy, you realize that, you're just a, emotional creature kind of flailing around sometimes. And sometimes I remember as a kid feeling incredibly blue one day. And since I was religious when I was a kid, going to my mom and being like, I think God's trying to tell me something because I'm suddenly really sad. And my mom says, okay, Greg, have a piece of cheese. And I was so mad. I was like, how dare you dismiss, my connection to the Almighty and my understanding of the universe. And then, of course, I had a piece of cheese, and within an hour, I felt a lot better. And I was like, ooh. So, like, sometimes your feelings are not, to say they're not infallible is a massive understatement.
Events in the last 6 months, I think, have been confusing and eye-opening for a lot of people. Again, talking about nuance, like, I want to dive into something that I think is a little bit misunderstood and get your opinion on it. So when Claudine Gay and Liz McGill gave their, now I'll call it, disastrous testimony in front of Congress about anti-Semitism on campus and the now famous "it depends on the context" lines, I think one of the reasons people were so upset is that they tried to invoke free speech as a defense for why they had not cracked down on hate speech or anti-Semitic behavior on their campuses. From my perspective, the problem with the response, and I've written, is sort of 2 parts. one, I think you could actually make an argument that what they were trying to say and some of it was not wrong, and that the principles of the answer. I think the problem for a lot of people was it was just disingenuous and incongruous with over a decade of behavior, as you've studied. In an article I wrote this. Since I figured I couldn't recap it better, I figured I'd just read it. I said, "Does anyone believe for a single second that the same "it depends on the context" answer or invoking free speech principles would have been acceptable in response to similar threats to other minority groups on campuses? Had these leaders equivocated for calls about hate crimes or extermination of Black students or students in the LGBTQ community, they would have been fired or forced to resign at the end of the day." For those who sort of, heard this and they were like, hey, again, funny that they were going to the free speech. Can you kind of explain more why this was so disingenuous? Maybe particularly because I think Harvard and Penn were the two poorest ranked schools in your free speech assessment.
Yeah, and I want to brag a little bit about the campus free speech ranking, because it's something that from my very first days at FIRE, people wanted us to rank schools according to how good they were for free speech. And I take my social science seriously, and I didn't want to be like, to go, it would be arbitrary if we just tried to do it based on what we were seeing. But then we got the capacity to do every year the largest study of student opinion ever conducted on the environment for free speech on your campus. And then we were able to put together the most comprehensive database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes together. And when you combined all of these, with a variety of pluses and minuses, if you handle the deplatforming case well, then you get a plus. But if you banned a speaker, that's a minus. Harvard and Penn were dead last out of 248 schools. Harvard actually got a negative score that we rounded up to a 0 in order to be more fair. And Penn, was not too far behind. So they did terribly. And I think the only way they could have really handled that testimony, other than being much better on free speech well in advance, which was, they can't go back.
It wasn't the time to go hide behind it, right? Yeah.
Was to come up and say, listen, we've been really unreliable on free speech in the past. I myself, Claudine Gay, should have stood up for the free speech rights of Ronald Sullivan, who was kicked out, or Carol.
And if people haven't looked at that case, Professor Ronald Sullivan, it's fascinating.
Or Carol Hooven, or I should have been more suspicious of the coincidental investigation of Roland Fryer.
Sorry, he was the one I meant. That's
they're all terrible cases. And then first apologize for being inconsistent in the past. Next, say anti-Semitism is a real problem in elite higher education, and that's also been our fault to a large degree for the oversimplified ideology we're teaching young people. And then say that, and then start defending free speech. I thought that Stefanik was being unfair in that she was demanding a yes or no answer to the question, and people keep on. And I give actually the respondents some credit here for being like, when it comes to, well, you're saying calls for genocide, and it's like, well, what you're really hearing on campus are students shouting intifada. And by the way, like something that I think is incredibly insensitive and offensive to shout. And from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Now, you have to bring it back to that because, one, is there any question that shouting intifada or chanting from the river to the sea is protected? No. And when it comes to the motivation that this is a call for genocide, I don't think that's what a lot of the students think they're saying. I think when they're saying intifada, they think they're saying resist. And when it comes from, and there's an incredibly embarrassing yet kind of wonderful article by the Wall Street Journal where they talked to some students who chanted from the river to the sea.
They don't know what river and what sea. Yeah.
They showed them the map, and here's the river, here's the sea. That's the whole thing. Did you know that? And generally they didn't. And then became a lot less comfortable with the chant in that case. So I think that the argument that things are either protected or unprotected depending on a larger context is actually correct. I also, however, think that particularly Claudine Gay comes from a discipline in which the word context is wildly overused, and she could have explained it so much better, and they just didn't. Do I think the double standard thing? is absolutely why they had no chance of convincing the anybody at that point. Yeah, that's why. And to this day, by the way, and I call this the silver spoon rule, kind of like the golden rule, but for elite higher ed, particularly Harvard, is they are so unwilling to admit they've ever done anything wrong.
Yeah. We haven't talked but danced around it, but what explain preferred speech and how that's dominated a lot of college campuses.
What do you mean by preferred speech?
The concept of how like free speech seems to have been bent in terms of preferential dialogues or
Oh
prefer
yeah,
yeah
yeah,
yeah
yeah. No,
yeah.
no, no. I mean, well, when you have a low viewpoint diversity, university when it comes to professors, and you have a administrative class that not only has in some cases virtually no viewpoint diversity, they actually think ideological concerns are part of their jobs in many cases, and some amount of orthodoxy policing. One thing that people don't know about DEI administrators is how often they've been, and we talk a lot about this in Canceling the American Mind, my follow up to coddling, how often they are involved in organizing some of the shoutdowns and helping along some of the campaigns against individual professors. So I think that the idea that
So you're
there
saying if you're the jury, you should not be speaking for the plaintiff or the defendant.
well, and the idea that there is preferred speech on campus is just simply a fact.
Yeah.
And watching the argument shift, from and I thought that the January, not January 6th, the October 7th response was so indicative because they also that double standard that I was referring to, they were making the argument that what is right, I think rightfully understood by Jewish students sometimes as sounding an awful lot like a threat to them, is something that they're going to bat for. But just a couple of weeks before, they'd been, in very somber terms talking about the hateful violence of fat phobia. And it's just kind of like, yeah, your bias is really apparent to everybody, but sometimes it doesn't seem you. And that's one of the reasons why I think the appreciation and trust in campuses, the trust in expertise generated by higher ed is so low at the moment. They kind of can't see how much they're sort of stacking the game in favor of arguments they like, as opposed to ones that they try to make, in some cases, entirely taboo.
Look, we hear the term thrown around. Someone who withheld money from Harvard, snowflake. But one of the concepts that you share in the Coddling American Mind is how restricting speech, trigger warnings, and this policing of discourse are just hampering kids' ability to learn resistance. One of the interesting things that I read, Tim Urban wrote a similar book that built on your work, and one of the things in that book that was fascinating was how he talked about this concept of rape law, and that this was a women's advocacy thing, but people were professors were dropping it and afraid to teach it because it was almost impossible in the context of trigger warnings. So they were just like, look, I'm just not going to teach this, at all. And it was kind of shocking to me to learn that. What is the consequence of this diminished resilience, or just again ability to not fall apart when something doesn't go right, when something you don't agree with or otherwise, because it seems to have real societal consequences.
Yeah, when it comes to the trends in rape law, that was something that I saw in action even when I was in law school, but really took on a life of its own. And you always have to point out, listen, if professors are afraid, one of the reasons why you talk a lot about the law regarding rape in criminal law classes, or at least you used to, is partially to as a way to explore sort of state of mind and different sort of standards by which you can find someone guilty, whether or not it's strict liability, for example. And so, like it's an interesting body of law. It's on a horrible topic, but lawyers were always understood to be adults capable, and at least we would hope, capable of discussing really difficult things, including criminal law. And so professor after professor saying that they're scared to teach this, or they don't really teach it anymore, is so disastrous because, and who does it harm the most? Victims of rape.
Victims, yeah.
It's just
people don't have the ability to make a case. I mean, the analogy, it sounds so crazy, but sometimes there's a reality of whatever you're doing. I'm sure there'll be some test case of someone applying to med school and saying they're grossed out by blood, and guts, and they don't want to do the labs, and that's harmful to them. And like,
I'd be shocked if that hadn't already happened.
Right? That sounds crazy, but how can you be a doctor if look? That's why I'm not a doctor. Like, I'm terrible around any of that stuff. Like but it seems like it's a requirement of the role and of the job.
Yeah, and you were asking kind of like what the long term problems with this is, and I think a lot of the long term threat is actually really quite profound, because one of the things that we point out a lot in Coddling the American Mind is that we've gotten young people used to intermediated relationships, where essentially you have someone is mean to you, well, then appeal to authority to correct that problem. And we have this in kindergarten, but we also have this in K through 8. Then we have it in high school, a little more uncomfortable. Then we have
funny. My son's school actually has a policy of self-advocacy. Like, they do not want the parents involved at all. Like, I think it's great. They're like, and they teach the kids, if you don't like the test, you go ask for extra credit. Like,
and some of these trends, I'm hopeful that maybe we help contribute to. Like, I was really happy that my kids' school, that they actually had doubled recess, and I'm like, yes. I know other parents might not be asking me that, but I am. But when it comes to the intermediated relationship, that's not, and of course, HR in corporations oftentimes functions like that well, particularly if you have, some of the ideologies embedded in HR that you see on campuses. I've seen this go very, very wrong for a number of companies. And that's not good training for teaching people to live in a free society. That essentially, well, how do we solve our problems? Authority.
I never thought of that way, but yeah. Then quickly you start to defer to authoritarianism. But the problem is everyone believes it'll be their type of authoritarianism, right?
Everyone always believes that.
Everyone believes it will be in their favor.
Yeah. No, and that's so typical. And it's something that we used to have better sort of societal norms for dealing with. I talk a lot in canceling about old idioms that were really excellent, that we kind of underappreciated, that were really nice pieces of wisdom for a free society.
Share something. I'd love to hear some examples. I was just going to ask you about that book. So
yeah, and including like walk a mile in a man's shoes, like basically. Don't judge a book by its cover. To each their own. Not my cup of tea. All these things that we would actually say that were really more or less like good small d democratic habits, which is check yourself. You're not the only person in the world. You don't know everything. You don't know what another person's been through, for goodness sakes. Pump the brake on judging people too much, and don't be so arrogant to think that you understand things that you don't. And sometimes people just disagree, and that's okay. And these are all ones that you'll barely ever hear anymore. My co-author, who's only 20, who's 23, not that wildly younger than a lot of us who grew up with this, but yeah, she just didn't hear these things growing up.
They're all super familiar to me. Well, let's talk about canceling the American mind for a little bit. Kind of a comprehensive exploration in cancel culture across the U.S. Again, I think we need some definitions here on cancel culture. I'm curious of yours, and then one thing I've seen, like, I guess this is what I see. Then I'd love to hear your example. But to me, like, there's a difference between someone upsets me, or I don't like a store, right, or something like that, and I opt out of. And again, a lot of people hide behind the opposite of, like, look, if you have a show and the advertisers don't like what you said, they have the ability to not advertise. But let's pretend, you say something I don't like or do something I don't like. There's a difference between me opting out of our relationship and wanting to pull away, and me using significant resources to try to make sure no one else interacts with you or buys from you. And that seems to be the difference, right? Always in a free market society, like, I don't want to advertise. But then there's a difference between me trying to make sure that no one does anything with you. Is that sort of how would you define cancel culture today? Because I think everyone uses a definition in their favor. They love it when it's on their side, and they don't. It's like free speech. It's the same context. They think it's great when it's on their side and not on the other side.
Yeah, and that's a normal part of human nature, if highly unfortunate. We just haven't been doing enough to fight that aspect of human nature, like we should. Certainly, fire spends a lot of time fighting it. So, our definition of cancel culture, it's we're trying to make it a historic argument for it, basically to say that cancel culture is a good term. It's the most sort of popularly understood term for the weird phenomena that started happening after 2014, where people started losing their jobs for their opinions or for their jokes that they made, not when they were at work. And so the way we define it, and I'm a lawyer, so it may sound a little technical, but cancel culture is the uptick of campaigns to get people fired, deplatformed, punished, expelled for speech that would be protected under the First Amendment. There, by the way, I'm making a little bit of an analogy towards public employee law, which brings in a tremendous amount of nuance and common sense. And I explain that a little bit more in the appendix of the book, but I didn't want to bog down the definition too much. And the culture of fear that resulted from that uptick. And we showed that uptick absolutely happened, particularly for professors. It was extremely dramatic, the number of professors who've lost their jobs over the recent past. And amazingly, in an environment where there already was such low viewpoint diversity.
And they lost their jobs for things within the classroom or within their work environment, or for things completely outside of it.
It depends. I mean, like we have cases where, someone cracked a joke on Twitter and lost their jobs. We also have cases where someone, had something in a research paper that got them in trouble, even though it wasn't academic misconduct. It was just a finding that students didn't like. We have, in-class comments. So it's the whole gamut of protected expression.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the really shocking things is how many tenured professors we've seen lose their jobs. When I started in 2001, I saw plenty of professors punished for speech that inappropriately, but I almost never saw a tenured professor fired.
Tenured professor is tenured professor, right?
Yeah. And now we're like 40 plus of the firings that we know are tenured professors. We're pushing 200 firings, 1,000 attempts to get professors punished. About 2/3 of them successful in some kind of punishment of the professor. And to put that in historical scale, the standard number of professors punished under the Red Scare, McCarthyism, 11 years of McCarthyism, is around 100. Actually, and it's about 62, communist professors was the number that they had at the time. And we know that it's about twice that in an environment in which the law is actually protective in a way it wasn't back then. Universities thought they could fire communist professors for being too doctrinaire and not being reliable professors. So the law is established, and it's already an environment where there's a million other ways to punish a professor without the extreme step of getting them fired. And one of the scariest things that we show in the book is how much of this is coming from students. It takes a lot of chutzpah for a student to actually decide, oh, I'm going to actually go after my professors now and sign petitions to get them fired for a lesson I didn't like. But that really went off the charts in 2017, and it kept on rising all the way through about 2023.
Yeah, and crazy and counterproductive. And one of the things, and there's an example you shared in the book. Again, to me, there's this difference of, as you said, the campaign. If I don't like something, I can withdraw. But then using all of my energy to a campaign to get everyone else to share the same belief, that is sort of where the cancel comes in. But it just seems this zero-sum game. So the example of the university, I don't remember what it was. I've read it several times, but this has happened multiple times. So a conservative speaker or someone comes to a campus. There is a liberal mob of students who assault them or prevent them from speaking or otherwise, and basically cancel them. And then what happens? A alt-right group of people look up the names of all of these kids, dox them, expose them. So it just shows that, like, ruining people's lives, just spending your time trying to ruin people's lives, doesn't have a net gain for society, for yourself. Because I've seen these stories where this loop happens over and over, right? If the one extreme tries to ruin someone's life, the other extreme will then try to. It just doesn't seem like it's worth it for anyone.
Yeah, and that's exactly the opposite of what we need to be encouraging in higher ed. But basically, we're I call it an unscholarly certainty that we're encouraging instead of whereas they should actually be learning to on every issue you should be able to engage in thought experimentation, devil's advocacy, and these are all incredibly difficult things, not even just debate, but kind of like what are the other possible theories of why this historical thing happened. We have in Canceling the American Mind, we talk about an example where there was a professor who taught this amazing lesson on how China moving from the gold standard to the silver standard led to a sort of global transformation worldwide that would eventually lead to the first trans-Pacific trading relationship between Spanish Bolivia and China. And the question after this utterly fascinating PowerPoint was the Columbian exchange or the European discovery of the New World, put that in quotes, was it worth it? Well, and it didn't lead the question at all. And even though there was only something like a dozen students in the class, or maybe 20, suddenly 1,000 students had signed a petition saying that asking if the Columbian exchange was worth it was asking students to defend slavery because slavery was part of what would eventually happen in the colonies. And it's like, wow, okay, like that's quite.
Where and these students were other students at the school, but not in the class.
I think it was other students at the school, but I think it was actually even include students who weren't even at the school.
Right, it's a big number for a 12-person class.
Yeah, with 1,000 people signing it, and meanwhile, it's kind of like, no, that's a perfectly valid question.
And what happened to the teacher?
He was suspended.
He was suspended. So again, the answer would be no, it wasn't worth it because of these horrible impacts of slavery. If you wanted to make that argument, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You could actually, but putting students in the uncomfortable position where they'd have to think about that, it's like, we're in such trouble.
Do you think people, for most of history, you got up, you didn't have maybe enough clothes to wear, enough food to eat, you were fundamentally uncomfortable, so you got used to that. And when things went right or whatever, maybe it was the aberration. Do you think, like, do we just flip too far where people are more comfortable as a baseline, and so this uncomfort with discomfort, because things aren't going to go right all the time, and they're not going to be perfect, and you're not going to have this gene to handle it anymore, this ability to handle it.
Well, I mean, actually, given you put it that way, did you read my short book, Freedom from Speech?
I know I haven't read that one yet.
That's my 2014 little tiny booklet.
All right, I'll add that to the desk,
where I make precisely this argument that essentially a predictable problem of comfort, which we call a problem of progress in Coddling the American Mind, is that people get less comfortable in a society that's progressing and becoming more affluent and allowing people to live in communities that reflect their values, which means are more politically homogenous, which sounded so nice in the 1970s, but has some serious downsides we've learned. That it's predictable that because certain other things are getting better, that there's a category of things that actually will start to get worse. And one of them is appreciation for freedom of speech, because freedom of speech done correctly is uncomfortable. It's something that is challenging. And so I do actually think that we're fighting a predictable societal trend towards people having, intellectual and emotional comfort as if it's a right that we have to, name and point out, because I think it leads to a lot of dysfunctional and potentially even, authoritarian outcomes.
One thing that David, Heinemeier Hansson said, who was on this show, and I think he grew up in Finland or Norway, he said he sort of went back and had a great appreciation for the difficulty of the American project, which we say, look, my country, we tend to agree on a lot of things because we are homogeneous. You are bringing together all of these cultures, all of the ideas, things that are, and so the expectation that everyone's going to agree on everything is very, far from reality. I actually never thought about it before I heard him sort of, explain it in that way, that this is sort of endemic to sort of the he called it the project that we have here, and it makes it harder, but at the same time, all the more important, I guess.
Oh yeah, no, I get this a lot lately too. That when the right's mad at us for fighting like a bad piece of free speech unfriendly legislation, or the left gets mad at us for any number of
Take it
things.
from both sides. Yeah.
Yeah, and but that people are like, like we're heading into, I think we're heading into probably a period of some pretty serious geopolitical instability. I mean, it's just I think that it's going to be tough to get out of this year, no matter who wins the election, in a situation that isn't chaotic. And that leads to all sorts of geopolitical implications. And I get this, argument from both sides that essentially it's like, oh, the stakes are so high, your little free speechy thing, is just not important anymore. And I have to be like, no, that's completely the opposite. When the stakes are very high, and when the rules of the road, the Bill of Rights matter more, not less.
All right, Greg, last question for you. What's a personal or professional mistake that you've made that you've learned the most from?
Oh my goodness. Oh wow.
And maybe in the context of free speech, it would be interesting, but I'll leave you wide open with that.
Yeah, no, it's really funny. Like with the ones that immediately come to mind, I'm like, can I actually tell that? Like in some cases, I hope I don't reveal too much, so I got to be a little cagey about this. Hiring, like occasionally, one thing that I've definitely realized is that interviews give you a lot less information than people. They can give you the illusion of information about somebody, and but still spending time with people that you're considering finding good jobs with is absolutely key. I made a very big hiring mistake that I won't get into details about, with someone that I realized that if I had just spent more time with him, I would have actually been like, oh, right. No, this is totally foolish. Now, it actually led to a situation in which someone who was much younger in the organization got a chance to really show what she was made of, and that worked out great. But I definitely think that I think I've learned more from being a boss, and running an organization and taking it from being very small to quite significant. That's the biggest learning experience of my life. And you bet I've made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, look, I've heard that a lot, and a lot of the really good hiring leaders I know have some sort of meal or driving experience, or how do we just spend time in the real world and because people will show themselves the more you give them opportunities to. One of the stories it's funny because I actually had this idea, and then my team told me it was a horrible idea, and so I didn't do it. And then I read an article about a CEO that did it, the same thing. It just proves nothing's original. But back when I was hiring, and we would typically sit down for a meal with someone just to talk. And again, you're seeing how I remember one person who was on their cell phone the entire time and texting, and you're like, all right, well, this isn't going to work. But my idea was actually whatever they ordered, I was going to have worked to the restaurant to bring them the wrong meal. And so there were three options there, right? There's I'm going to eat the wrong meal and not going to say something, right? That's going to tell you something in itself. I'm going to rudely, send it back. And a lot of people don't realize when they're being rude, or I'm going to really nicely say, I'm sorry, but this is the wrong meal. And it would tell you a lot. So it's funny because there was an article of the CEO that actually did that. I thought it would be indicative of sort of someone's character.
No, I actually think that's a pretty good one. I feel like there's a right answer to it.
Right. For me, it's the middle one. I know someone that did a very similar thing where he always got in the car with them driving to his family's house for the final round interview for the executive team. Again, are you lawless, breaking speed lights? Are you aggressive but within the boundaries? Or are you absolutely timid? And it was a very similar sort of thing, and they thought it was fairly helpful. But
at Fire, we don't hire anyone unless we've done a 5-day ayahuasca trip with them.
It might have all kinds of other legal implications.
Turns out it's a terrible idea. I think a lot about like what actually speaks to people's character. The main thing that we really do try to get at is, are you comfortable defending speakers you detest? And like there are right and wrong answers to that, but also how uncomfortable it makes somebody tells us volumes too.
In your world, I could see that mattering a lot. All right, Greg, where can people learn about you, Fire, the books? Where should they go?
Thefire.org. Please, sign up. We have a 1,000,000-person strong free speech army, like people who will sign letters and will help us actually fight the kind of cases you can't win or that would be too slow to win in court. So we really do need your help, and we really need to spread the word about Fire. I'm also on the Substack, the Eternally Radical Idea, which is a reference to freedom of speech, which I believe is radical in every generation. It's always a radical idea, and you can find my books wherever books are sold, both Canceling of the American Mind and Coddling of the American Mind, but also my first book, Unlearning Liberty, and my little tiny booklet, Freedom from Speech.
I'm gonna add that one to the list. Well, Greg,
Richard Dawkins liked it.
I'm glad we made this happen, and I hope that this isn't the type of topic we dive in normally, but I think it's just pervading companies and families and organizations now. And I think hopefully you've provided a helpful framework for people to sort of sharpen their own pencil and their own philosophy and ideological thinking about how this impacts their workplaces and their families and their lives.
Well, it was a real pleasure chatting with you as well. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to your audience. And I enjoy your Substack as well.
Thank you. So to our listeners, thanks for tuning into the Elevate podcast today. We'll include links to Greg and his work on the detailed episode page at robertglazer.com. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to follow the show to be notified about new episodes and have them downloaded automatically into your podcast player. If you're listening in Apple Podcasts, simply hit follow on the show overview page or the 3 little dots in the upper right corner if you're on an individual episode, and then hit follow. You can also hit follow on CastBox, Spotify, Pandora, or your favorite podcast player. Thanks again for your support, and until next time, keep elevating.